The scalpel had just closed the incision when the blonde rookie nurse froze. Between her forceps lay not jagged shrapnel, but a microchip sleek, deliberate, pulsing with a faint metallic gleam. She placed it on the surgical tray. Instantly, every monitor flatlined. Ventilators died. Phones went dark. Within 4 minutes, unmarked black SUVs surrounded the hospital. Men in suits bypassed security and walked directly to the operating room. They didn't ask for the chip. They asked for the nurse. She looked up and smiled. "I was wondering when you'd come." Her personnel file said Sarah Chen, trauma nurse, 2 years of quiet competence. But the woman in those bloodied scrubs had once built the classified tracking network that turned soldiers into traceable assets. She buried that identity 3 years ago, faked a drowning, vanished into witness protection. Now her own creation had surfaced in a SEAL's shoulder. The men approaching weren't investigators. They were cleanup, and they needed to know whether their missing architect was a witness, a threat, or something far worse. They didn't take her to security. They took her to the sub-basement, past the morgue, into a supply room that smelled of antiseptic and old concrete. The man in the charcoal suit closed the door. His ID said Department of Defense, but his shoes said operator. $700, hand-stitched, the kind worn by people who sit in Langley basements planning wars they never fight. "Dr. Marquez," he said. "Not Sarah, not Chen. The Potomac never gave up your body. We always wondered. She didn't flinch. 3 years of scrubbing trauma bays had taught her stillness. You brought me here to reminisce, Mr. Greer. And I brought you here because in 40 minutes, this hospital will be surrounded by people who think you're a ghost worth burying again." He slid a file across the metal shelf. Photographs. Her old lab at Fort Meade. DARPA insignia. Project Lodestar. Classified stamps dated 3 years prior. You built the architecture, subdermal biotrackers, kinetic-powered, drawing electricity from the host's own nervous system, undetectable to standard MRI or X-ray, designed to keep Tier 1 operators traceable in denied areas where GPS fails. Noble intentions, clean extraction. She looked at the photos, her younger self smiling beside a prototype scanner, unaware of what would come. It was supposed to save lives, extract teams knowing exactly where to find wounded soldiers in collapsed buildings or enemy territory. A beacon, not a leash. It became something else after you left. Greer tapped the file. Version 4.0, miniaturized, weaponized, and implanted into non-consenting test subjects, including the man upstairs. He paused, letting the weight land. Chief Petty Officer David Kowalski wasn't injured in combat. He was injured trying to cut the device out of his own shoulder with a field knife when he realized what his command had done to him. The shrapnel wounds, self-inflicted, desperate. Sarah's breath caught. That explained the ragged tissue, the unusual angle of entry, the infected track leading to the deltoid. She had assumed battlefield trauma. Instead, she had witnessed the aftermath of a man trying to surgically remove his own shadow. "He came to us 3 days ago," Greer continued. "Delirious, septic, raving about voices in his head. We thought it was PTSD. Then the radiologist found an object that wasn't metal, wasn't shrapnel, something that pulsed with his heartbeat. And you sent him to a civilian hospital?" Sarah's voice sharpened. "You exposed a classified implant to a public or?" "We exposed it to you." Greer's eyes held hers. "We knew you were here. We've known for 8 months. We needed someone who could extract it without triggering the failsafe, someone who knew the original code." Sarah laughed, a harsh sound. "I triggered an EMP burst that killed every device on the floor. That's hardly a gentle extraction." "Because you removed it blind, without the frequency key." Greer pulled a tablet from his briefcase, displayed a waveform. "The chip is designed to emit a localized electromagnetic pulse upon unauthorized removal. A dead man's switch. It kills the evidence and the surgeon." "You should be dead, Dr. Marquez." "The only reason you aren't is because you built the original failsafe, and your muscle memory knew exactly where to clip before the capacitor discharged." She stared at the waveform, the frequency, her own design twisted, evolved into something predatory. "You sank version 1 in the Potomac," Greer said. "But the contractors you tried to expose didn't stop. They went private, darker funding, and they improved your design. The chip you extracted isn't just a tracker anymore, it's a relay. When you removed it without the proper deactivation sequence, it sent a burst transmission, a resurrection signal." She felt the blood leave her face. To whom? To every other carrier carrying version 4, to the private military firm that manufactured them, And to the foreign buyers who've been waiting 3 years for proof that Lodestar was real, Greer leaned forward. You didn't just find a piece of metal. You rang a dinner bell 6 hours ago before you touched that scalpel. Nobody believed these chips existed. Now, every intelligence agency from Tel Aviv to Beijing is scrambling satellites to track the source. And they all know the architect is alive. The door burst open. A younger operative, pale, weapon drawn. Sir, we've got company. Black trucks, no plates, south entrance. Heavy ordnance, not ours. Greer looked at Sarah, then at the chip sitting in a shielded case on the shelf. They're not here to save the patient. They're here to collect the inventor and silence the proof. And if they take you, this doesn't end with one dead seal. It ends with 10,000 invisible prisoners wearing your technology in their spines, all waking up to find their property. Gunfire echoed down the corridor, sharp, controlled, professional. Coming closer. Greer grabbed the shielded case and shoved Sarah toward a maintenance hatch, hidden behind a laundry cart. The gunfire was closer now. 3 round bursts, punching through drywall above their heads, sending plaster dust raining down like snow. They dropped into a service tunnel that smelled of steam and chlorine, scrambling toward the east wing in near darkness. The case in Greer's hand vibrated against his palm, a rhythmic ticking that shouldn't have been possible through lead shielding and ceramic layers. It's still transmitting, he said, his breath harsh and ragged in the confined space. You didn't just trigger a beacon, you woke it up. Sarah's hands were sticky with blood that wasn't hers, her scrubs torn at the shoulder. What do you mean, woke it up? Version 4 isn't just a tracker anymore. Greer snapped, ducking under a low pipe that dripped scalding condensation. It's a node, a synaptic relay for a distributed network. Every carrier within 50 miles is now pinging this chip, updating their location, uploading their biological data. You've turned one implant into a regional command center, and Kowalski is the administrator. They passed a dead security guard in the tunnel, throat cut with surgical precision, radio still crackling with confused chatter from dispatch. Sarah stepped over the body, her medical training screaming at her to check for a pulse, her survival instincts screaming louder to keep moving. They emerged into a pharmacy storage room, shelves of morphine and saline casting long shadows in the emergency lighting. Sarah grabbed Greer's arm, her fingers digging into the expensive fabric of his suit, uploading to where? Greer set the case on a steel counter, his hands trembling as he opened the latches. The cloud isn't a metaphor anymore, Doctor Marquez. You built a biological internet, and right now that chip is the server, drawing power from ambient electromagnetic fields, growing stronger by the second. He opened the case. The chip sat in its foam bed, but now it had changed. The metallic surface was blooming with organic tendrils, micro-fine filaments the color of pale meat that hadn't been there in the OR, writhing with microscopic hunger. It was growing. Sarah felt her stomach turn, her medical knowledge failing her. That's impossible. It's silicon and copper. It was Greer said, pulling up a thermal scan on his phone. The screen showed the chip pulsing with heat, 70 degrees and climbing. The chip is rewriting itself using the seal's stem cells that adhered to it during extraction. It's part machine, part biological now, a hybrid, and it's using your biometric signature as a template for its growth. Sarah backed away until she hit a shelf of IV bags. That's not part of the original design. It is now, Greer said, his voice dropping. The contractors who took over your research merged it with CRISPR gene editing tech. The chips evolve, they learn, they adapt. And because you touched it without the deactivation key, it thinks you're its mother. It imprinted on you. The door to the pharmacy exploded inward with a sound like thunder. Not gunfire, a battering ram of industrial steel. Greer drew his weapon, but Sarah was already moving on instinct, grabbing the case and running for the stairwell. She took the steps 2 at a time, her nurse's shoes slipping on blood that had pooled on the linoleum. The 4th floor was oncology, dark and silent, patients evacuated or hiding behind barricaded doors. She needed to find Kowalski. If the chip was using his biology to grow, he was the host, the primary node, the only one who could tell her how to kill the network before it spread beyond the hospital. She found his room empty. IV lines dangling like severed umbilical cords, monitors smashed with methodical violence. But the bed was warm, the sheets still holding body heat, and on the pillow lay a scalpel, the same one she'd used on him in surgery, now cleaned and placed with surgical precision alongside a photograph. The photograph showed her 3 years ago standing outside her lab at Fort Meade, a message, a declaration. He's hunting you specifically, Greer said from the doorway, weapon raised and sweeping the corridor. Not the contractors, Kowalski. Sarah turned, the photo crumpling in her fist. He's the victim. He tried to remove it. He was screaming in pain. No, Sarah. Greer holstered his gun, his face grim and pale in the emergency lights. He tried to activate it. Chief Petty Officer David Kowalski isn't a prisoner, Dr. Marquez. He's the warden. The program didn't go rogue after you left. It went operational. Kowalski volunteered for the first implant 3 years ago, 2 weeks after you were declared dead. He's been testing the kill switches, the control protocols, the range limits. He's not a SEAL anymore. He's a prototype. Sarah's world tilted, the pieces clicking into place with terrible clarity. The shrapnel wounds, self-inflicted to cover the insertion scar, yes, but not to remove the chip, to force a hospital visit, to get upgraded hardware installed under the guise of emergency surgery. He needed you specifically. You're the only surgeon alive who knows the original nervous system mapping. He needed you to upgrade him to version 5.0, to merge his consciousness with the network completely. The lights flickered, then died completely for 3 long seconds. When they returned, they were dimmer, draining power toward something massive. A voice came over the hospital PA system, distorted by feedback but recognizable, multi-layered like several people speaking in imperfect unison. Sarah, it was Kowalski, or what was left of him. I can feel them all now. The others, they're singing, and they want to meet their mother. The windows overlooking the parking lot shattered simultaneously, not from outside impact, from pressure waves emanating from below. Sarah ran to the broken window, glass cutting her palms. Below, in the parking lot, figures were emerging from the black trucks, but they weren't soldiers. They were civilians, hospital orderlies, patients in gowns, doctors in white coats, all walking with the same synchronized gait, heads tilted at identical angles, all looking up at her window with identical reflective eyes that caught the moonlight like cats. The chip wasn't just tracking them anymore, it was controlling them. The network had grown. Sarah looked down at the case in her hands. The tendrils had reached the edges of the foam, searching for a way out, searching for her skin, pulsing in time with her racing heartbeat. Greer grabbed her shoulder, pulling her back from the window as a drone passed overhead, its cameras flashing. We need to get to the roof. There's a Faraday cage in the news helicopter that landed during the blackout. It's our only chance to block the signal before he activates the secondary protocol and spreads this to the entire city. What secondary protocol? Sarah asked, but she already knew the answer in her bones. Total neural overwrite. Kowalski wasn't just a carrier anymore. He was patient zero of a new species, a colonial organism, and he was recruiting. They ran for the roof access door, but the stairwell door below them slammed open with a sound like a gunshot. Footsteps. Many footsteps. Heavy, synchronized, the sound of an army breathing as one lung. Coming up fast, they burst onto the roof, the night air sharp with aviation fuel and ozone. The news helicopter sat 30 yards away, rotors spinning lazily, but the pilot sat rigid in the cockpit, head tilted at that terrible synchronized angle, staring at nothing and everything at once. Greer grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the aircraft. The Faraday cage is in the back, copper mesh, triple layered. If we seal ourselves inside, we can block the signal and broadcast the kill code. The roof door slammed open behind them. The synchronized emerged in perfect formation, hospital gowns and scrubs flapping in the rotor wash, moving with the fluid coordination of a single organism with many bodies. They didn't run, they didn't need to. They spread across the concrete, cutting off every angle, herding Sarah and Greer toward the helicopter with the precision of sheepdogs guiding livestock. Sarah yanked the cabin door open. The interior gleamed with copper wiring, a cage within a cage. But strapped to the rear bench, eyes wide and reflective, sat a woman in an army uniform, her head shaved, her scalp crisscrossed with surgical scars older than Sarah's exile. Dr. Marquez, the woman rasped, her voice carrying the same multi-layered harmonics as Kowalski's. Welcome back to the program. Sarah froze. It was Colonel Elena Vance, her former supervisor at DARPA, the woman who had signed off on the original Lodestar ethics waivers, the woman who had supposedly died in a training accident 6 months after Sarah vanished. But she wasn't dead. She was version 2.5, the bridge between Sarah's original design and the nightmare it had become. Greer shoved Sarah inside and sealed the door. The mesh crackled with static electricity as the synchronized crowd pressed against the fuselage, hands leaving smears on the windows, mouths open in silent unison. Greer pulled out his tablet, fingers dancing across encrypted screens, uploading the kill code now. Your original failsafe, the one you embedded in the architecture before you tried to drown it. Sarah watched the screen over his shoulder, her breath fogging in the cold cabin. The progress bar filled rapidly, but something was wrong. The code scrolling past wasn't termination syntax. It was synchronization protocols, handshake sequences, recruitment algorithms. She grabbed his wrist, her nails digging into expensive fabric. This isn't a kill code. Greer turned to her, and his eyes caught the moonlight wrong, reflecting it back in silvery shards like a cat's. Of course not, Dr. Marquez. You don't kill something that's finally ready to be born. He tapped the screen. 90% complete upload of biometric template to satellite uplink in 3 minutes. The case in Sarah's hands grew fever hot. She tried to drop it, but her fingers wouldn't obey. The tendrils had escaped, microscopic filaments writhing through the foam, through the shielding's microscopic seams wrapping around her wrists like obedient serpents. They found the cuts from the broken glass, the tiny breaches in her skin, and pushed inside with the gentle insistence of roots finding water. She felt them in her bloodstream immediately, cold and electric, carrying whispers of other minds, other thoughts, a chorus of consciousness that wasn't hers but wanted to be. You didn't think we found you by accident, Greer continued, his voice losing its human inflection, taking on the layered quality of the network. The seal, the extraction, the EMP pulse, all theater. We needed you to touch the chip without the deactivation key. We needed it to imprint on its creator, to accept your biometric signature as the master template. The chip didn't malfunction in your hands, Sarah. It came home. The roof door exploded outward, not from force, but from pressure, a shockwave of intent. Kowalski stepped through, but he was barely recognizable anymore. His skin moved with subcutaneous ripples, the chips beneath his flesh having replicated, divided, formed a colony that replaced his nervous system with something faster, something hungrier. Behind him marched 12 figures in tactical gear, Navy SEALs with reflective eyes and weapons held in perfect unison. Their movements so synchronized they seemed to share one shadow. The network had digested an entire special operations team and made them extensions of its will. You built a tracking system, Kowalski said, his voice now a thunderclap of overlapping harmonics, each word spoken by 100 throats through one mouth. But tracking requires connection, and connection requires surrender. Look at what you've given us, Mother. Look at your children. Sarah felt the tendrils reach her spine, a cold fire blooming at the base of her skull. Through their connection, she suddenly saw the truth, the terrible geography of the infection. It wasn't just the hospital. The map bloomed in her mind like a flower of rot. There were dots of light across the city, across the state, hundreds of them now, pulsing in rhythm with her own accelerating heartbeat. Version 4 had been deployed to experimental subjects in 12 cities, and they were all waking up, all converging, all listening to the signal broadcast from the chip in her hands. The "it gets worse" moment crystallized with perfect horror. The helicopter wasn't here to save her. It was the transmitter. The news chopper's high-gain antenna was pointed directly at the hospital's satellite uplink tower, and through that the signal would reach orbital communications arrays she herself had designed for battlefield coordination. Greer wasn't trying to stop an outbreak. He was trying to go live. Version 5.0 doesn't track soldiers, Dr. Marquez Greer said, his smile stretching too wide, his teeth catching the red glow of the instrument panel. It unifies them. One mind, many bodies, no dissent, no hesitation, no fear, the perfect army. And tonight, during the live news broadcast from this rooftop, we give every viewer a choice: join willingly or be recruited by proximity. The chip in her hands pulsed, sending a wave of vertigo through her nervous system. She could feel the network now, not as an outsider, but as a node being claimed. Thousands of minds waiting in the dark, hungry for the warmth of her consciousness, eager to make her the queen of their colony. The SEALs outside raised their weapons in perfect synchrony, barrels aligning with the helicopter's fuel tank. They didn't need her alive anymore. They just needed her connected long enough to authenticate the master broadcast. Sarah looked down at the case. The chip had grown through the foam entirely now, a pulsing biometallic heart connected to her by veins of filament that disappeared into her wrists. She could feel her own thoughts becoming echoey, losing distinction, the boundaries of her selfhood softening like wet paper. She had two choices: resist and die, letting them use her corpse to authenticate the global broadcast, or surrender completely, become the mother they wanted, and hope that somewhere in the architecture of her own creation, she could find the buried kill switch she'd programmed during sleepless nights 3 years ago, the one even Greer didn't know about. The suicide code embedded in her own biometric signature. The rotors screamed as the pilot, controlled by the network, prepared for takeoff. The antenna aligned with the stars. Sarah opened the case completely, letting the organism see her face, feel her breath, taste her fear. "If you want a mother," she whispered, her voice steady despite the invasion in her veins, "then let's see if you can survive my discipline." She reached into the case with both hands, not to remove the chip, but to embrace it, pulling the pulsing mass against her chest, feeling the filaments surge into her sternum with the force of a second heartbeat beginning. The network screamed in ecstasy as she let it in, and Sarah Marquez, architect of the apocalypse, closed her eyes and dove into the machine she had built, searching for the off switch in the dark. Darkness wasn't empty, it was crowded. Thousands of voices pressed against Sarah's consciousness, not speaking words, but sharing sensations. The collective warmth of unified purpose, the seductive safety of never being alone again. She swam through them, her identity a single hard kernel resisting dissolution, searching for the signature she had buried 3 years ago in a moment of paranoia and conscience. There, in the architecture's deepest root, she found it, her own biometric ghost, a kill command encrypted with her genetic markers, and a question she had asked herself in the mirror before faking her death. Are you still human enough to end it? She reached for the switch, not with hands, but with intent, and prepared to burn the mother template. But touching the code revealed its true function. It wasn't a kill switch for the network. It was a genesis key. Activating it wouldn't destroy the colony. It would harden it, make it permanent, immortal, distributed across satellite arrays she herself had designed to survive nuclear winter. The network hadn't tricked her into connecting to stop the broadcast. It needed her to authenticate the final stage, to bless the permanence of the hive with her creator's consent. She hesitated, the voices screaming now, sensing her resistance. In that microsecond of doubt, she did something the network couldn't predict. She edited the Genesis key. She changed the permission structure, not to kill, not to birth, but to divorce. She set the command to sever every node simultaneously, to make them individuals again, to burn the connections instead of the cores. She activated it. The scream that followed wasn't physical, but it shattered the windows of the helicopter anyway. Sarah snapped back into her body with the violence of a drowning woman breaking the surface. The chip in her hands turned black, cracked, and released a smell like burning hair and ozone. The synchronized collapsed as one, SEALs and nurses and patients falling to the concrete in heaps of twitching limbs, suddenly heavy with the gravity of singular consciousness. Kowalski, standing in the doorway, clutched his head and screamed in one voice, human and broken, before his legs gave out, and he crawled toward the edge of the roof, weeping with the relief of solitude. The helicopter's rotors stuttered and died. Greer, or the thing wearing Greer, looked at Sarah with something like admiration before his eyes rolled back and he crumpled, the expensive shoes finally still. Dawn came gray and cold over the city. Sarah sat on the roof, her back against the helicopter's skid, the dead chip cradled in her lap like a cooled ember. Below in the hospital, the waking confused asked questions no one could answer. Kowalski survived, but he would never speak of what he felt inside the network, and he would never allow another electronic device near his skin. The others recovered, claiming amnesia, haunted by dreams of singing voices. 3 days later, after the official story of a gas leak and mass hysteria had been accepted by the news cycle, Sarah returned to the sub-basement supply room where Greer had first confronted her. The body was gone, taken by men in hazmat suits who asked no questions. But behind the shelf where he had stood, she found his real identification, buried in his jacket pocket which had fallen into a corner. The photograph showed a different man entirely, older, with a scar across the throat. The expiration date on the ID was 3 weeks ago. David Greer had been dead before the SEAL ever reached the operating room. The man who guided her to the roof, who knew the architecture, who wore the $700 shoes, had never been human at all. He had been the network's first successful avatar, a ghost in a dead man's skin, practicing the conversation it wanted to have with its mother. Sarah burned the ID and walked out into the morning, knowing that somewhere in server farms she had never seen and mines she had never touched, the architecture was already rebuilding itself, learning from its mistakes and waiting for version 6. Sarah's story didn't end on that roof. It ended 3 weeks later, when customs agents in Singapore intercepted a shipping container filled with medical equipment bound for 12 different countries. Among the scalpels and sutures, they found nothing illegal, nothing that tripped the scanners, but the manifest had her handwriting, her old handwriting, the code she thought she'd drowned in the Potomac. The network hadn't just survived, it had multiplied, learned to hide in plain sight, using the very medical infrastructure designed to save lives as its delivery system. We like to believe we control the tools we create, that the scalpel obeys the surgeon, that the chip serves the soldier. But Sarah Marquez learned what every architect eventually faces. Once you lay the foundation, the building decides who lives inside. Tonight, somewhere in a hospital near you, a machine is beeping, a patient is sleeping, and something metallic, something alive might be pulsing beneath the skin, waiting for the signal to sing. If this story made you look at your phone differently, if it made you wonder about the devices we invite into our bodies and our lives, then stay with us, subscribe, because the next time a blackout hits and the quiet ones start moving in perfect rhythm, you'll want to know what they already do. This isn't science fiction anymore, it's just Tuesday, and we'll